And Nate doesn't appear to be here.
No, he doesn't. Let me ping him.
Okay.
He's online not long.
Okay.
So meanwhile, basically, I've just been on the implementation side, working on integrating the block store. So nothing for me on the research side.
Nothing for me either. Although I was hoping that you would have an update, Greg, in terms of the spec that you're putting together for our chain.
Well, actually, one thing. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, so I did have a discussion with Nash and Mike and Kyle about having a block size, and I think the conclusion was that we're not going to have a block size, and we're not going to slash for having. We're not slashing for invalid blocks apparently, so we're gonna be in danger of a DOS attack either way, and that was sort of the push I got. Yeah.
Whether or not there's a block size limit.
Well, so the answer seems to be no right now.
Yeah, but because the reasoning is that there'll be a DOS attack whether or not there's a block size.
Yeah, exactly. Although,
okay. But it doesn't sound like the problem with the DOS attack is solved though, right?
You mean the DOS attack problem? I don't think we can solve it unless we slash for invalid blocks, right?
Yes, I think we have to slash for invalid blocks by mainnet.
You have to. I don't think that's true. You don't necessarily have to slash. You have to eject. You have to eject them. So
okay, there has to be punishment, right?
You have to be able to stop checking if someone's messages are invalid after they sent you a bunch of them. Essentially, you have to
of course. Correct. There has to be some form of modification of behavior, whether that's a disengage. I mean, it's like a parent, right? Either you disengage, or you actively punish.
Right. So sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, so what do you think about this idea of, when you're running your fork choice, when you're running the ghost rule and you choose the next block, when you're trying to fetch a block, you sort of pretend you don't see it if it's too large based on some kind of subjective filter that you have, and then you don't go ahead and don't fetch it.
So I'm not a huge fan of this mechanism. I mean, it's basically the mechanism that EOS is supposed to be using, as an alternative to the actual metering. And basically, the problem with that is that you can get a block where they disagree, and some of them are willing to accept it, and some of them are not, and then this kind of splits the network, as everyone who's building on it has all of their blocks also ignored. And everyone who's not building on it has let's say, for example, a lower score if they're in the minority. So it can.
Glad you.
So what if you had?
I thought I muted myself after I was done talking.
Okay.
Yeah. So what if you had a subjective filter that basically says, well, okay, we have a hard limit, or not a hard limit, like a soft limit at 1 megabyte blocks. But then if you see that more than half of the network is sort of accepting this block, then you sort of gradually increase that soft limit until when you see that everyone else besides you has seen the block, then you just push it up. You just accept
I mean,
it.
hopefully just a majority and not just everyone else, because there'll be no liveness if you say everyone else. Because if like one moves offline, you won't see it.
Okay, yeah. So yeah.
So as soon as you see a majority,
yeah, that's true.
With a block in the chain, you could include it. I mean, like the problem there is that like a majority coalition controls the block size.
Yeah. And so you would argue that having a hard block size is better than having a majority coalition that sort of arbitrarily dynamically sets the.
No, I would actually not like. So actually, what I would probably like, especially given like the requirement that validators be able to make blocks at any time, is that actually validators have like a fixed amount of gas that they can use during their whole like per say like per period, and then like it's up to them like if they want to make like one big block and lots of small blocks, or a bunch of same size blocks, but as long as like every validator contributes a bounded amount of size every hour or whatever relatively short time period, then you can have flexibility, but also not have this big risk, which is that the network will be blocked down because every validator still sends a bounded amount of I don't know if you're thinking about kilobytes, com events, like whatever the measure of the cost of phlogiston. I don't know. So whatever the you can have like a kind of bounded rate, even though every individual block is technically only bounded by that that bound for the whole period. But if you make a block that size, you only get to make like one block the whole period.
Yeah, I see. So you do this for all elements of like basically gas, and then also just pure size, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I guess it's just those two.
I like this kind of approach because it's because it's it gives them flexibility while not allowing them to DOS the system. There's also smoother approaches where instead of thinking about just the like a discrete periods, you do like more of a moving window, where like in no window are you ever allowed to send more than some amount. And so like as long as in the last whatever window you haven't sent too many big large blocks, then you could like send a big one, as long as it doesn't like push you over. So more of a sliding window approach. Notably, that also puts a bound on the amount of validators, the amount of gas that a validator can consume. So basically, what I was saying is, you need to think about not about the blocks, but about the number of blocks that the kind of total capacity of all the blocks produced by every validator.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool.
But in terms of Byzantine nodes, you're just dropping messages if you receive more messages from Byzantine nodes, unless they're in the justification of non-Byzantine nodes.
So we're planning to slash for equivocations, but for invalid blocks, yeah, we can just eject. Or I mean, we're not going to slash.
Well, I mean, whether so if you. I'm not really asking about what you're considering Byzantine. I'm just wondering once you see someone be Byzantine.
So you don't think so? What do you think is Byzantine? Because I thought that is just equivocations for now.
Well, that's what I was thinking about. But you could expand that definition if you want.
I see. No, that is our definition. Or yeah.
I'm happy with that answer for testnet, but not for mainnet. I think we really have to slash for invalid blocks and other things.
Yeah, we might want to have a meeting with Nash and Mike and Hal then, because they were pretty adamant about not slashing for invalid blocks because that would,
but you could still eject,
or in case of a bug.
Yeah, so you could, but the idea is like, eject and don't slash probably, so that way people aren't as concerned about losing all their money over a bug. Although I think there should be some analysis done to see if what bug is actually more likely to be caused by what kind of behavior is more likely to be caused by a bug.
Well, I really want to make a distinction between slashing to the bone versus
ejection.
No, there's an in between, right?
Oh yeah, a little slashing without ejecting.
You can slash a smaller amount than the entire stake. So it's still costly. There's still a deterrent, but it adds up quickly, especially in the case of invalid blocks.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I mean, of course, I think the main reason why, we're probably going to ship things without slashing for invalid blocks right now or at first is because it's just easier. But because we have to implement. Sorry,
it's not easier if you're DOSed.
Oh, but that it's just not slashing doesn't mean we don't eject. So
but again, you have to have some kind of response.
Yep. Basically, well, especially if it's expensive to check message validity, which it probably will be relative to.
No, that's
sorry. I meant difficult. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think
if it was really easy to check validity, then it maybe would be not as bad. But because it's hard to check validity.
As long as the blocks don't have, if your block format description doesn't have reordering, as like in JSON you can do reordering, and still have the legal utterance in the spec. That's just stupid, because it does make format validity be computationally expensive. But if you don't have some kind of nonsense like that, then it's a type check, and it's a relatively inexpensive type check at that.
Well, it's slightly expensive because you still have to run the ghost rule, and I don't know if that's a type check necessarily. I mean, you I don't know. There's logic for it.
Hang on, I would make a distinction between format validity versus semantic validity. So the format, you can first check that the format of the block is okay, and if the block is well shaped, right? Then the next check is the ghost rule.
Oh yeah, for sure. Right. Yeah, protobufs
separate
sort of automatically take care of that for us. So yeah, I agree. The format validity is pretty cheap.
One idea for DOS prevention that is, like the very standard idea is to do proof of work. That way, you basically will check the proof of work first, and if the proof of work is valid, then you'll go and bother to check validity.
Yeah, that's so environmentally.
Depends what the difficulty is, but I agree with you that it's not as attractive as this kind of identifying Byzantine behavior and just refusing to listen to for more.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, I feel like this is an implementation detail, but we can.
I feel like we agree on the ultimate end, but there's arguments about how to get there in terms of which roadmap. But the question that we're raising now that's kind of relevant is like, if you don't slash for equivocation, for invalid messages, how do you prevent DOS?
That's correct. Right.
And I actually think this is like a good argument for detecting the invalid blocks and at least whether or not they're slashing. and kind of not just detecting them, but storing in the peer, who made the invalid blocks, so that in the future when you receive blocks from them, unless they've already been signed by someone else, you don't.
So my argument is that not slashing to the bone is superior to ejection, because if you eject, then you're drastically lowering the security of the network. But if you slash just a little bit, you're not. So in other words, the security of the network remains higher for longer periods of time if you just have small slashing.
I don't disagree with that. But did you hear my suggestion here? It was a little bit different. It wasn't ejection even. It was just on kind of very similar to the way that the peer-to-peer network on the blockchain today will ban peers who send you invalid messages. And they're also like a little forgiving. So or there are I'm pretty sure they're forgiving. But if they're not, well, there are forgiving algorithms where like you give someone like a few invalid blocks before you.
It's like a social moderation. You're banned for some period.
Yeah, and it's not even like you're banned from all the network. It's just like anyone who's received an invalid block from you will be like, okay, not going to bother checking things from you anymore. Especially if they've received like 100 invalid blocks. You can pick a number where like if you send me too many invalid blocks, I'll just assume you're DOSing, and then we don't hear from you again for some period.
Okay, so but
this is more like a strategy.
Yeah. I feel like that's actually more expensive to implement than, that feels like it's a lot more complicated. That logic is more nuanced and easy to get wrong.
The other downside is that when you slash partially, you're effectively doing like a validator rotation at that point. And so you'll have this chain which
if you reweight
has a sorry what?
You mean if you reweight, if you reweight after the partial slashing?
Yeah, was that not your idea though?
It's not always the idea. So
you can slash but not reweight. And so they would still have the same weight.
For example, like in the way that I have it in my mind right now is like, I reweight every 100 blocks, and so like it takes a little bit.
Yeah, so you can keep the slashing the small. I'm just going to adopt the terminology small slashing or small step slashing, either one. You can keep small slashing to the point where it's not detectable from a weight perspective. As long as there's enough delta between the weights for some period of time, right?
Yeah, but even if it's kind of so the reason why I don't adjust their weight for some period of time, even for large reductions in weight, is just because it like creates overhead to adjust the validator set too often, and so. I just throttle it to once every 100 blocks.
Understood.
But from the point of view of like, the fault tolerance of the protocol, it's exactly the same. From the point of view of the economic security, it in some sense is reduced slightly after the first penalty because there's less disincentive now. But of course, like, that penalty itself was using some of that disincentive to stop them from making invalid blocks. So it's kind of normal. But in terms of fault tolerance, in terms of it doesn't change the story.
Understood.
Until there's a reweighting.
Yeah. So
I guess.
Go ahead, Ken.
Thanks. So the only worry I have is like, are we doing this only because we're worried that there might be a bug, and so that if we like slash to the bone, people would be worried, or sorry, that would deter validators from joining in the first place?
I think that's why this conversation's happening. Yeah.
So I see, but if that's the case, it's also kind of like all this sort of small slashing and then reweighting after from the weight. A lot of complicated logic that could introduce more bugs. Like I feel like just cleanly slashing to the bone would be the simplest, and I don't know.
Yeah,
like
it's totally clean and simple, and I totally wouldn't be against that for an initial launch. But then basically you have to, like, tell people to plan for their deposits being slashed at first, or what you can do is you can you can make them really paranoid and try to get them to run everything really redundantly. Another thing, or like another thing you can do is, instead of having the slash deposits be burned, have them be transferred to the co-op, and have the co-op have a policy where, like, if they were to determine that this was because of a bug, they would reimburse.
Oddly that you should mention that. That's exactly what I have put in the spec. Is that slash stuff is returned to the co-op, and then the co-op has the prerogative to return it if it turns out to be a bug.
Yeah, so that I think is a super sensible short-term solution. In the long term, no one likes it because in the long term it means that the co-op has a strong incentive to ship buggy code, get paid.
Of course. So Michael, that speaks to your question. So I've divided the work into kind of what I would call an external spec and an internal spec. So the external spec is an updated version of the document that Nash produced, which is in the GitHub under the validator sale directory in legal docs. And so that doesn't
paste a link.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I'll just email it out to you. I'm not at a point where I can easily paste the link.
Yeah, cool. That works too.
Okay. And I'm working on a internal spec that's more for devs, right? So I mean, people can work off of the external spec, but it doesn't really talk about how things are done. It talks a little bit more about what, and I think that we need some intermediate discussion along those lines that I think would be helpful for the dev team. So I'm working on that as well.
Anything we should talk about here?
Well, I mean, actually what I'd like to talk about just from a research perspective is I've kind of gone down this rabbit hole a little bit. It's a slight departure from the protocol we've been talking about. But because we have Rho, we have a piece of structure that we're not exploiting at all, and this is really just a toy protocol. It's not really it's not something I'm suggesting is the right way to implement things, but I'm just looking at it because I can write things down a lot more simply. If you look at the Y Combinator version in Rho calculus, you have a lot of control over when code gets replicated. So now if you think about a validator is out of the game if their code isn't replicated, right? So if they're the thing about a validator is effectively a server, and the only way for a server to continue running is if their code is replicated. And so this is equivalent to slashing to the bone. So you can make variants of the combinator code in where you're dependent upon another population of processes to replicate your code, right? And if they decide not to replicate your code, that's the equivalent of being slashed to the bone. Let me just stop there and make sure people have understood what I'm saying.
So replicate the code means like, like let the validator continue to run essentially.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Right. So here's the basic scheme for replication. If we're just in pure row, right? So the basic scheme is there's a little process that looks like it's receiving y from x, and then what it does is it starts running y in parallel with sending y back out on x. And then if you run that in parallel with sending on x, that code in parallel with some other code, say p, okay? Then the result is that p will be, infinitely iterated. So that's the core scheme. But now you can modify that, and you can modify that so that you only get to iterate p if everyone in a group agrees to iterate p, right? And now, so you following what I'm saying there?
Yeah, but I'm also wondering if you can replace that with end in the current fork choice rule.
Yeah, there's a relationship between fork choice, but that's slightly different, right?
I mean, it just seems a little closer to our context than just like some group.
Right. Well, the group, of course, is the validators.
Yeah, but all of them.
All of the validators are effectively going to have to. Yeah. To get closer and closer to our protocol, what you start doing is looking at weighted sets of these, right? Right, and then the point is, I have like some minimal tools to be able to control when a consensus group allows for a validator to be replicated, and I can write that down like really simply in the row calculus. It's not
okay, but it sounds like what you're saying is, you have a simple, like, you have a simple way to like write down a rule for when a validator is allowed to continue producing blocks.
That's exactly right.
And I mean, it sounds like, I don't know, like what advantage you have over our current mechanism, which is like, if your weights are not in the parent of the block you made, like you're not allowed to make up that block.
Because it's 10 lines of row code as opposed to pages and pages of spec.
Oh, there's almost no spec for the validator rotation. Validator rotation is like super simple. Like the spec is really mostly for the consensus protocol, not really for the validator rotation.
Yeah, well, and then I can do proofs using by simulation, and I can pull this out. I can.
Okay, I hear you, but what I'm saying, I guess, is like, I bet that, what you're talking about can be implemented in like exactly the same framework as we currently have validator rotation. Like instead of having like an updated weights map, instead you have this row calc term.
Right, but I guess that's my argument is that it ends up being, it's just very simple. It's very, like I can do all of the reasoning equationally. I don't have to say what a map is. There's lots and lots of stuff that is very straightforward to do in this. It becomes just algebra, not a lot of English.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
that,
hear you.
to me, that's very advantageous, right? If I can hand 100-line program over and say, here's the spec for the consensus protocol, or even a 250-line program for the consensus protocol, that's a major advantage.
Right. Well, whereas like what I'm doing right now is like, I give formulas, but like it's all set theory, and you have to kind of like work to implement.
Yes, exactly. You have to work to implement the set theory semantics. You have to interpret the set theory semantics.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that's kind of why down this rabbit hole.
It's all I know how to do, Greg. It's all I know how to do.
Well, we all use the tools that are lying around.
Yeah, but I mean, I hear you. I wish I could, specify everything in RoCalc instead.
Well, I mean, it could be any calculus whatsoever. It's
right. That's what I mean. I mean, in terms of like a formal semantics of some rewrite system.
Yeah, right. That's all. So Michael, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. So. It did. I didn't catch when you expect to let us take a look at the internal spec.
That one is probably another 3 days away.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's not so bad.
But the external spec is like,
yeah, a good starting point. Yeah, got it.
We're committed.
Cool. I'm interested in this just from like a sort of just planning perspective of what we need to be working on next. The Casper team is expanding a little bit, and so we're going to need to start divvying out some work to some of the new developers.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Understood.
That's exciting. Who are the new peeps, and are they not on this call?
We've got Ovidu and Danyar. They were both already brought onto our team, and we're previously working on some of the other things, and we're just recruiting them over to Consensus to sort of
I see.
Yeah, push ourselves towards testnet, which is coming up quite quickly.
Yeah,
I could totally invite them to this call.
Yeah, I mean, you probably should, but it's up to them whether they want to show up.
Yeah, totally.
Nate's getting
I'll pass on the information.
Yeah, no worries. So in terms of the testnet launch, have you guys worked out the DOS attack stuff yet?
So if we I was wanting to go back to the earlier conversation because it wasn't clear. So in my head right now, it's like for testnet, we have slashing for equivocations and nothing really for invalid blocks. And then for mainnet, we're going to have like so if we're going to have this code, like if you get slashed, we return your deposit to the co-op, but we slash you to the bone for invalid blocks. Is that the consensus here?
Well, I mean, I think it is something that addresses all of the concerns in terms of, DOS incentives and people being afraid of bugs, in a way that is more immediate than partial slashing.
Well, I would much prefer to have still partial slashing and just return the funds, because
okay.
I mean, if you think about it, right? That if some validator is producing, whatever, 1,000 blocks a minute, even if you're, doing partial slashing, that adds up really quickly.
Yeah, but after they've lost their deposit, it doesn't matter what you slash. They're still going to be able to. There's just going to be no more disincentive from producing these inbound blocks. So at some point, you have to start ignoring them.
Right, but I mean, if you ignore everything from someone that has no deposit, right? That's.
But are they going to get partially slashed to 0, or are they going to get partially slashed like 10%?
Check their deposit. If they got no deposit, you don't answer. You don't listen.
Well, I mean, technically, yeah. I mean, you check their weight in the consensus protocol, which should be their deposit. But unless their weight is adjusting block to block, there might be a delay.
No, but if you adjust like every n blocks, right, then that's going to be sufficient. That lines up with that actually gives you the
it gives them basically but they can make any number of blocks before that end block.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. So the size of the partial slash is related to that end.
How? I don't know. I don't follow.
So you want
Oh yeah. Well, so they could. I guess the argument is like, oh, they could at most make like n blocks in that time.
exactly
And without equivocating. That's not actually true though. With a little bit of help from another peer, or like another two peers, they could make a whole bunch of blocks on different forks below that height.
Sure.
Without equivocating, just by like switching between forks.
Right, but in that case, on either fork, after n blocks, they're done. Right?
Yeah, well, basically, I think in that case you have like n, like the number of peers times n, a number of blocks at most, without it, with no one equivocating. And then like if someone's equivocating, I think we might be able to get that number up.
Sure, but so that gives us a pretty crisp way to do partial slashing.
Well, a way to bound people from making too many invalid blocks before some height without equivocations. I would love to see more precise numbers, but yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. The nice thing about the full slashing approach is that like after you see a single invalid block from a validator, you can just like totally ignore them except for as you see them through other validators. And there's definitely simplicity there. Although I totally hear you. I agree with you that your solution is better. But
well, I mean,
it's also more to argue about.
I'm optimizing for a certain flavor of security, right? I mean, the other approach is optimizing for a certain kind of overhead, I guess is the word.
Yeah, basically there's different, you're thinking about security in terms of the amount of deposits and participation, which I think is totally warranted. And I'm just thinking about the DOS attack.
Right.
I mean, I would just like to not use proof of work, right?
Yeah, of course.
And the perfectly attributable faults combined with just banning them works fine. When there are for liveness faults, basically there needs to be some kind of rate limiting based on timing assumptions.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I guess what we could do is, a back-off protocol. That's typical here, right? What typical in network protocols if you get some kind of invalid communication, you can do a back-off. So it's like banning, where you go, okay, I'm not listening to you for the usual interval times. Yeah.
And then times like the previous interval times like 2 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm a fan of exponential backoff as like a general strategy. However, I just want I think we should be thinking about not just the invalid blocks, because those are relatively more manageable than the valid blocks that are just too numerous or too large, or like their total size in terms of phlogiston or kilobytes is too large.
Right.
So like that question to me is, I think, more unaddressed in this context, in our context. So like, how do you stop someone from making too many valid blocks?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess the thing is, if everyone knows that the protocol demands an exponential backoff, right, then it becomes more and more expensive to produce the invalid blocks relative to the response from the network.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about the valid blocks, though. I'm asking about valid blocks.
Oh, okay. So if it's DOS in terms of valid blocks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, do we really care that much?
Absolutely, because it can bring the whole system to a halt, because it can make
it. But valid blocks are going to be valid, including the justifications. So that's a lot of work.
Sorry, are we talking about valid blocks again?
Yeah.
Because
validity includes justification validity.
Yeah, but you know, we need to check validity for valid blocks or invalid blocks. The extra work for the valid blocks comes from the fact that we can't exponentially back off using this strategy that they're like, you know, like using the same strategy because.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is like is it really DOS at that point?
Oh yeah, it totally can be, not because of the invalidity of the message, but because I mean, because this message has all sorts of other things in it. So imagine if you know,
like made up transactions or
so the classic example of like a super powerful attack is where when you can make a block that is relatively easy for you to validate and relatively difficult for other people to validate, and you produce a lot of them, so that other people just cannot keep up. They can't keep up with the chain, but you can, because you can validate all your messages quickly, but no one else can. And so the idea.
I see. Well, I wonder if that's really the case. Like, because the only other validity check here would be whether or not it's a COM transition.
Okay, but this was an example where I assumed that all the nodes had the same capacity. But like the same kind of example happens whenever a single node has more capacity than the other ones. And so you could just, like, you know, even assuming that validation and producing valid messages are the same amount of work.
But if it's a valid block, then that means it's got a COM event in it, right? And so, you know, all the other validators can weigh in, right?
But they can't weigh in fast enough is the point. So if the other validator is going too fast, they're going to be like forever catching up on history.
Yeah.
And that's like a pretty bad DOS, because what it means is that like the none of the validators except for the attacker are on the longest chain. You know, I mean, imagine, think about it like this, right? Every validator has a pending pool of blocks they have yet to check. Just like that they've received but they haven't checked yet. And like that pool could be terabytes if you don't have any limits on how many valid blocks someone can make.
Yeah, but I mean, we may have this anyway, right? So we may have like some validator that's way out in front, but if the stake weighted majority is not there, then they're on some fork.
Yeah, but the point is that like you know, the majority can fall behind and just like, you know, just like completely do nothing but follow the blocks from the attacker, because the attacker just like builds on the tip, and like and the majority is just kind of struggling to catch up, and so they never end up making the lead in like a new fork by themselves.
I mean,
this is kind of like, it's kind of what happens like in like when Ethereum is pushed to the limit. What happens is like a Geth nodes, or, you know, sometimes parity nodes, but most of the time Geth nodes like struggle to maintain the current state, and that is really bad. Like because they like, you know, they're calculating the EVM, but they're like however many blocks below the tip of the fork choice. And
this is a fairness requirement.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think DOSing. I think I'm, you know, I think like fairness will. So if you have like some, like, oh, I won't validate more than 10 messages from you before I validate any message from someone else. That might mitigate, but we need to, like, you know, think carefully and do stress testing, because you know, we could. I mean, I'm definitely not comfortable with the idea that like there could be an unbounded number of
Yes. So I'm with you there. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that anybody gets to be attended to, more than anyone else, right? So if someone is producing a whole bunch of blocks faster than everybody else, well, you'll see. Then the protocol is something like you'll see some percentage of their blocks that's maybe even stake weighted, right? Versus when you go and attend to everyone else.
The thing is that the other people might refer to these other blocks in their messages, and so you could
but the referrals, if you follow a stake weighted, if you follow a stake weighted protocol, then the referrals will also have a particular shape to them.
Sure. You can. But exactly. So, but this kind of thing is super relevant. Like if your new block that you're adding to this chain includes like 100 blocks from this one validator who's doing a DOS attack, then like that definitely should contribute to the amount of your budget that you're spending.
Yeah, fair enough. So it's a good it's a good consideration. I still feel like it's
the thing the way I normally think about this is like, I would meter things and have some bound and basically try to prove that a validator will never have to consume more than like 10 million gas every 15 seconds or whatever it is. And so and that way you can kind of show, like, if you can show that there's like a bound on the capacity required to be up to speed for a particular shard, then everyone can make sure that like they have at least that capacity, so that whatever happens on that shard, it doesn't unexpectedly bog down any of the validators on that shard.
Yeah, I mean, you could also make it a slashable offense if the fairness in your net. Oh, that's harder, isn't it? Because you may have network failure.
Yeah, it's definitely harder than it was. Also harder to do back off than it is with just the invalid blocks.
No, I'm not thinking about back off. I'm thinking.
Yeah, but it's the same kind of concept where like you're trying to penalize based on some somehow the notion that they're doing something wrong isn't well defined yet.
No, what I was saying was something different. What I was saying was that when you propose a block, if I look at your block and I look at your justification distribution, the distribution ought to align with our notion of fairness and stake weight, right? So if your referrals are all skewed in one direction, then you have an unfair justification tree, and because it's unfair, we slash you.
Yeah, but I guess like I don't understand that well enough to say that that's like that I recognize that as like a well-defined slashing condition.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I haven't been precise. I'm just trying to convey the intuition before I go down precise.
Yeah, I mean, I hear the intuition, and I think it makes sense.
It's actually,
but somehow I'm more comfortable with the idea of like just giving them a budget for like how big their blocks are, how many they're supposed to make. That's like objective and verifiable. Like where if they just like make too many, it's like a clear offense.
I understand your argument. Yeah.
Do you mind if we?
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to move back if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I didn't. So if we're gonna return funds back to the co-op when people get slashed, can we not partially refund them that way for, I guess, mainnet launch? Like essentially, I'm trying to.
Greg is just trying to prevent the the amount of deposits like plummeting suddenly because of like a bug here.
Yeah, so that was, I mean, that's why we're returning funds to the co-op, right? And I'm saying on top of that, even
that's why partial slashing. Returning funds is so that people don't refuse to join from the risk.
And it's not automatic, right? It's not like the funds are automatically returned. But
yeah, it takes time.
I feel like you haven't been heard yet. What are you trying to say?
Well, I was trying to say that you could also partially refund from the co-op if, even if there was no bug in the code and, there were some validators that, really it's pretty clear that, they've been honest for a long while. And, if they can explain themselves somehow why this happened, then, the co-op could partially return their funds too. And like, that would sort of be a substitute for partial slashing. And we could implement more complex logic in the sense that, you deal with it through human sort of talking instead of algorithmic, coding up front.
Oh, okay, so I hear you, and that makes a certain amount of sense. What I was trying to balance with the partial slashing is that let's say that there is a bug, okay, and 50% of the validators have inherited this bug. Then when you slash to the bone, they're all gone. 50% of the security of the network is gone, just evaporated. Whereas if you do partial slashing, they're still around, they're still in the game, and you can detect the bug, right?
And maybe fix it before the partial slashing adds up to remove everyone.
Exactly. That was my consideration.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. That makes sense now. Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of unfortunate that could not happen, but I'm sort of hoping that if there is a situation where more than a majority of the stake ends up being slashed, then that is quite a strict requirement for a hard fork or something like that.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sure, yeah. But again, that's not incompatible with partial slashing, right? You can do both.
Yeah, actually, I agree. Actually, I'm for partial slashing too. I just don't know I'm hoping to be able to push it after mainnet somehow. I guess I'm sort of worried about this. Essentially our testnet should be almost exactly like mainnet, and already it won't be because we're sort of pushing slashing invalid blocks, whether we do it partially or fully.
I get it.
After the testnet, right?
But don't you already have the code for slashing invalid blocks? Slashing validators for making invalid blocks?
We have the code for validating invalid blocks, but not slashing yet. We don't have. We have
the validation code is still sticking around.
Yeah, and we're sort of planning to reuse that logic for slashing. Yeah, so we sort of have to wrap some primitives back in.
That makes sense.
Yeah, implementation stuff. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would much rather push to get slashing for invalid blocks, partial slashing for invalid blocks. I'd much rather get that push in because I feel like it's a far more secure network.
I think partial slashing for too many blocks also is I think that the too many valid blocks DOS attack is significantly more concerning. But I'm also sympathetic, and I think that I think that full slashing and refunds is like the easiest thing to do. But somehow I say that just because it's really easy from the point of view of DOS, but actually we haven't solved the DOS problem for valid blocks yet. And it might be that the solution for that also deals with the DOS problem for invalid blocks.
Yeah. So we've got like 2 minutes.
I could talk about my update. I don't know.
Well, whatever you can get in 2 minutes, I have to jump over to Deb's.
Okay. Well, I've been spending all week and more on the safety oracle proof, deep in the weeds here with the definitions and the of clique and clique oracle, and the threshold required for the clique to be a clique oracle. And I'm still working on it, making progress. Basically, it's turning out to be harder than we thought. Because we had our proofs initially were set up for dealing with a situation where all the validators see the same equivocators, and now we're kind of generalizing to a situation where they may see different equivocators, and we still want to be able to give our clique definition. And so it's totally requiring some changes in the clique definition. Although we're still going to have our currently existing clique definition, which working in the context of them all agreeing on the equivocators. But if they see different equivocators, what can happen is those we have to also make sure that those equivocations can't see later disagreeing messages, which we don't currently do in the clique definition. And so I'm just in the deep end on the clique oracle proof, and I'm hoping to be done today, but I was hoping to be done yesterday, and I was hoping to be done the day before that.
Understood. I hear you. I need to talk to you. Can we jump on a Skype call a little bit later today, Vlad? I want to talk to you about that. Actually,
sure. I've got 2 hours now free until I'm gonna be busy for maybe 6 or 8.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm booked until 11.
Okay.
Maybe this evening.
Ping me on Telegram. I'm more on Telegram and Skype these days.
Okay. Sounds good. All right.
A lot more. Okay.
All right. Ciao, guys.
See you guys.
So